This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Our favorite trio of talking heads, John Katzka and Hamilton and Robert Kraig, are here once again to opine on the ongoing situation being described as genocide in Burma, impacts of a long-awaited reform in Saudi Arabia, and the evolving role of the top diplomat in the Trump administration's foreign policy universe. But first to Spain, where leaders in Catalonia claim a formal declaration of independence for the region is imminent. What's driving this movement, and how will Madrid respond? John, maybe you could start with a little background on who and where Catalonia is.
What a mess. Catalonia is a province that has a fairly high degree of autonomy within the Spanish system. It is probably one of the more successful of the provinces economically, which probably is one of the reasons that the Spanish want to hold on to it. This independence movement has really been running for about 5 years now. There may be connections that go back to the what was the field marshal's name? Franco, to the Franco period, and then may even go back before that. But right now, it has to do more with the desire of a political group to have independence. Now, the opposition to this is rather significant. This all came to a head on October 1st when an illegal election occurred, which was supposed to define whether or not the people of Catalonia were in favor of independence. 42% apparently voted. There may have been more if there hadn't been such control over where people could go to vote. But 90% of those who voted apparently were in favor of this. Now, the parliament who called for this vote is supposed to meet in special session on the 9th of October to formalize the results of the election. And why don't I let that slide over now to...
Well, Ann, one of the slogans that animated this movement was "Madrid is robbing us." What do they mean?
Well, they are, as John said, they are the most economically successful part of Spain at the moment, and they pay more out in taxes to Madrid than Madrid gives to them as a region. However, since the downturn in Spain, the major economic crisis in Spain, Spain has given them their debt to the capital, actually to Madrid, is quite high. So on a regular basis, they pay out more taxes, but it's unclear whether, if they declare independence and actually try and go through with it, they'll have to provide for their own defense. They have a rather small, about 17,000 police now are from the province itself, but they'll have to provide for their defense, set up a central bank, all the things that states need to do. Plus, it's likely they won't be in the European Union. I mean, the European Union has come out very much against it. It's very unlikely. So they would be facing an adverse economic situation with the rest of Europe. So it's not clear whether they would gain by declaring independence.
So one of the things, Robert, the central government was criticized for was sort of the heavy-handed response to this referendum. And clearly they didn't want it to happen. Clearly they said it was illegal. But talk a little bit about just what went on in the street.
Yeah, and there's Conservative Party controls Spain, and they have simply said it's illegal, and refused to recognize it, and then attempted to physically stop it. Not successfully, and the things didn't still happen, but successfully enough to have all sorts of pictures of, of security forces with billy clubs trying to prevent people from entering polling places. They still are, though. They have the force, right? They have the military. And so, quite frankly, they probably have the ability to do that. There doesn't seem to be any movement right now that would have an armed rebellion. It's not the South before the U.S. Civil War yet. And of course, Lincoln used force to try to hold the Union together. So by the same arguments Lincoln made, you can make arguments in favor of Spain. But what's interesting is that most other nation states, they had this assumption, apparently, some of them, that a bunch of nation states would come to rally to their defense if they did this and support this, and that's not been the case.
Venezuela has come to
their... But there's been a lot of other stateless nations, like the Quebecois or Scotland, that have come forward. Right, exactly. So it's hard to know where this goes right now and whether this actually ends up in an armed resistance, because Spain certainly has a monopoly on the physical force to hold the nation together at the moment.
Madrid has the ability under Article 155 of the Constitution to take over control, basically wipe away the autonomy that the Catalonians have right now. That would be an extreme movement and would likely lead to more violence. There is talk of a mediator, but why would Spain want to have a mediator come in to negotiate what basically is their responsibility to rule?
Well, we've heard a lot over the many years of, Robert, you referenced this, the Basque separatist movement, and that always or has often involved violence. Have we seen anything other than this kind of referendum and political maneuvering in the case of Catalonia?
In terms of violence? Not that I've read about. I think it's been very much based on language, very, very strong support for the Catalan language over a number of years, requiring it in all government jobs, and a sense of building this national identity. It's been much more about identity and language than the history of repression under Franco than it has been about economic issues and terrorism. There were similar roots in the Basque situation as well, but it hasn't evolved into the terrorist kind of conflict that was.
Interesting, the king, when he came out and made his remarks, he was criticized because he also speaks Catalan, and for not speaking in the language and speaking to the people there. So the language is a very important component of this. It's really important in it.
And the Prime Minister really, I think he played his cards completely wrong, because actually all the polls, including the latest parliamentary elections in 2015, they never have had anything, it might be 48% for pro-independence in Catalonia. So the province is very, very split, despite what these votes show us, because the non-independence groups stay home. So it's...
So the EU has sort of characterized this as an internal Spanish matter. Talk a little bit about some of the ramifications were this to go forward for other nations, both within the EU and elsewhere, that are less than thrilled at this prospect.
The EU, this is a frightening thought. This is not what they need to deal with as they're talking about unity. I mean, it reminds me that on a philosophical tone, that when things begin to get a little tough, people really break down into very narrow, defined groups. And we're seeing that across Europe. We're seeing it around the world. I mean, we're going to move into one of our topics today is another one of those examples.
But, I mean, there are other parts of the EU, certainly, and other parts of the world that have sort of restive provinces that would like autonomy or self-determination.
Hungary and Transylvania, for example.
Scotland, the Kurds, for example, outside the EU, obviously, right?
Corsica, too.
It's a real question. I mean, should 50% plus one of the population be able to pull out of Spain? I mean, In the United States, we say major policy needs a supermajority of some kind, right? If you look at our constitutional framework. So I'm just saying it's an interesting question, even what would be a legitimate process to determine this, even if you are someone who thinks that any nation should be able to secede, kind of the South's position in the American Civil War. And there's a kind of an economic kind of equity thing here. This is a richer part of the country trying to not redistribute income to the poorer parts of the country, but it might cost them more, as Anne was pointing out anyway, right? Because of having to set up your own army, your own customs service.
Well, and similar to what's happening with Brexit, companies and banks are already talking about moving to other provinces or moving out of the country to protect their interests. So Catalonia could be a loser in that part of the process.
And it's a lot of the younger people, and there's also a class divide where a lot of the service sector workers are actually from other provinces, and the wealthier people employing them are Catalonians. So there's a class divide here going on too, and an age divide.
Right.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. It should be moving forward one way or another very soon. So now let's move on to Burma, where terms like ethnic cleansing and genocide are being applied to actions being taken by the country's Buddhist majority against the Muslim Rohingya. So, Anne, what's going on there?
Well, it's another mess, to quote John. It's in the last, there was an attack, I should step back. The Rohingya, there are about 1 million Rohingya who are a Muslim minority in Burma or Myanmar, and
actually, I think we've got a map we could take a look at. Just,
they have long been repressed, and in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, at least 500,000 of them out of 1 million have crossed the border primarily into Bangladesh and are overwhelming their hosts in Bangladesh, which does not have, as we know, it has very high poverty levels itself. And overall, with the Rohingya who had previously gone to Bangladesh, there are now 800,000 Rohingya in Bangladesh. So it's a huge humanitarian crisis.
well, just to put that number in perspective, that's well over double the number of Syrian refugees who entered the EU. So we're talking about a very large-scale movement of people. Right.
Huge number, and they're in desperate condition. I mean, in desperate situations.
So, Robert, the situation that sort of drove this was something that was ongoing, as Anne mentioned, for quite a long time. But there was a sort of proximate attack by an armed Rohingya group that the government used as sort of the precipitating event. Talk a little bit about that.
Right, and we have allegedly the restoration of democracy in Myanmar, and Nobel Prize given to its leader, and then but the military is still in a very strong position, and then we have this discrimination against the Rohingya has been it's been ongoing for a long time, and in fact there's a supremacy doctrine that sees the Muslims who are poorer as inferior actually, and there's a very heavy level of racism. And so, literally, yeah, you're right. This armed attack by a small group became an excuse for the military to engage in what human rights groups are calling ethnic cleansing. It's denied by the country vehemently, but you have not only reports, Human Rights Watch has said that it's a crime against humanity, potentially, what's going on. We're talking about murder and large-scale rape, et cetera. But to have 500,000 people suddenly flow into Bangladesh this quickly, it's not just the amount, which is tremendous, but it's the number, which tells you how much panic there is and how brutal
Bangladesh is not really capable of taking on.
Bangladesh is totally, so you have and if you see the pictures, it's just clear, just on the visuals. And so we have and there's a mounting disaster there where those people are very in great danger, are very insecure, and are not drinking clean water, et cetera. And in addition, we don't know how safe the people who are still behind back in Myanmar are. So this is a horrendous situation. It is driven by a long-standing racism of the Buddhist majority against this Muslim minority.
So one of the interesting aspects of this is, Robert, you referenced the leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was very much celebrated in the West, as you mentioned, Nobel Peace Prize.
From poster child to goat.
And now she's actually been stripped of at least one prestigious international award.
Oxford University, yes, yes, took it away.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean, what is the position she's in right now?
Well, she is there and living in the midst of that crisis. She's not in Oxford anymore or concerned about what the West is saying about this. She has to deal with her military. And the military, you know, was known for these types of activities before this issue came up. This issue actually goes back to the 70s. Right. And there was an agreement back in '93 called the Rohingya Repatriation Agreement. And she wants to go back to discussing that. But apparently both countries, Burma and Bangladesh, want to do this bilaterally because before the UN was involved, and the UN won't repatriate anyone who doesn't voluntarily want to go back.
Right.
And Bangladesh doesn't want all those volunteers sticking around.
Yeah.
Well, an ongoing tragedy, again, we'll have to keep our eye on. And now to what in some circles is a much happier set of circumstances. In Saudi Arabia, the government has announced plans to allow women to begin driving next year. So rights advocates hail the move as long overdue, but others fear that maybe the government is getting too far ahead of its conservative population. So first of all, what exactly was decided?
Well, I mean, as strange as it sounds, I know some people who follow Saudi Arabia know this, the conservative bent of the country and the power of a particularly traditionalist sect of the Muslim religion has been so strong that women have not been allowed to drive. And in fact, there's a very large number of immigrants from other Middle Eastern countries who are there just as chauffeurs to drive upper-class women around. And so their jobs are now threatened. So the new crown prince, who is in line to become the king, is obviously pushing for modernization. So this is appealing to the younger, more urban part of Saudi Arabia, but it comes at great peril. If they go too far, they could create instability and even create a kind of a violent response from religious traditionalists. So it looks like they're trying to figure out how far they can push to modernize but at the same time not be too far out in front of the religious traditionalists. And some people think this may be too far. Some people think it may be far, but tolerable in terms of stability. So it's important not just for the women of Saudi Arabia, but also really for trying to project the future of this regime in this country.
It actually goes more beyond the religious because it's also the family, the Saud family. Several branches were pushed aside as bin Salman was moved up to be the crown prince and the heir apparent. And there's likely to be some pushback on that account as well. You have to remember that one of the reasons that the Saudis did not let women drive was because they thought there was a cleric that came out with a ruling on it saying it would mess with their reproductive capability.
I can tell you that's not true.
Oh.
Well, you know, we've made several references to the crown prince. I think it would be worth talking a little bit about historically how succession has worked. The current king is one of a long line of the sons of the founder of the kingdom, which meant the succession has moved from brother to brother within the same generation, which guaranteed basically a geriatric leader at all times. The current crown prince, and by all accounts the king, is rather frail, so he's likely to depart the scene one way or another sooner rather than later, is in his 30s. So that in itself is quite something for the society to digest.
And 70% of the population is 30 or younger, and many of them have I mean, there are a lot of educated Saudis who have spent time abroad. The society has changed, and the younger generations is quite different than the older generations. So you have all sorts of divides, but with this huge population that's now facing very few economic prospects because of the oil market and what's happening and what that's doing to Saudi Arabia.
And then we have the Crown Prince's grand plans of 2035 to take Saudi Arabia off the oil.
Right, all the changes, yeah.
And but we cannot forget that the role of stability in the country has been based on the marriage between the Saud family and the Wahhabi religion, and women in driving by itself does not change that, but it certainly lays a marker down, and I suspect that we'll see some reaction coming back on it.
And so what about that? I mean, is the calculus that this group of under 30, the elites who have been chafing under the old system and would like reform, are now a sufficiently significant block within society so that, that's where the smart play is?
Anyone's guess. It's really anyone's guess. I mean, we'll see in terms of, but this is like court politics. So it's like trying to figure out the old French court, right, and its relationship with the Catholic clergy, 400 years ago. I mean, so it's a real insider game.
Well, we'll move now to another insider game with our resident diplomats. The U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said this week that he had no plans to resign, and speculation about his departure has continued as his department's formal diplomatic efforts have often been undercut by presidential tweet. So the question is American diplomacy in uncharted waters? And I'd like to read, if I could, a quote from Richard Haas, himself a former State Department type, who says, Rex Tillerson has been dealt a bad hand by the POTUS, the president, and has played it badly. For both reasons, he cannot be effective. The Secretary of State should resign. So what do we think? Can he be effective at this point?
I think his main goal right now is the reorganization of the State Department. And which downsizing is a form of reorganization.
We're talking about at a scale of cut by a third.
Yes. I'm not going to say where my personal feelings are on this matter.
Well, the pensions have not been touched so far.
So far.
Okay.
I think the media is playing this up way beyond its importance.
Well, let's look at one of the situations that are driving this. When Secretary Tillerson was in Beijing and trying to cultivate a channel with Pyongyang, he was shocked to find a tweet while he was there saying, there's no way we're going to talk to these people and why bother, and, don't waste your time, Rex, from the president. So what does that mean to someone in the field trying to promote diplomatic solutions?
I guess I don't have a State Department pension, so I agree with Richard Haas. And I think that, he is very ineffective. It's fairly predictable in the sense that you have Donald Trump, who had no political experience, and Rex Tillerson, who had, experience dealing with a lot of foreign leaders, but he doesn't understand how government works. And the two of them as CEOs are, clearly going to clash. They're not used to dealing, having to defer to another person. And I think that he's really, I know people want him to stay because he seems to be sort of a symbol of stability and some sort of, and wisdom, and he's close to General Mattis and all. I mean, this is some of the talk that we hear. But I don't think he's doing any favors to the State Department. He's not advocating for them. The fact that downsizing, in my opinion, is he's not thinking things through in a way that, and by all accounts, morale is just horrific there.
So, Robert, what does it mean when what's being said by the top diplomat is then immediately reversed and undercut by the president. I mean, how does that change his perception by allies and others around the world?
Well, surprise, surprise, CEOs don't know anything about how to run government or to run diplomacy. And so the problem is you can say that he's being undercut by Trump in the tweets. Of course, it's very hard to conduct diplomacy that way, but if you yourself don't know how to conduct diplomacy and have some bizarre kind of restructuring of the State Department, not announced to anyone, vision, it's unclear what the vision is for what the State Department should be here, other than clearing out expertise, which doesn't seem to be an especially effective way to do things, especially when we have a very well-staffed, secure, intelligence operation, defense operation, the Pentagon, and our diplomacy is already underfunded compared to the rest of the military establishment. So I don't understand what that vision is, nor has a case been made for it. So it would appear that he can't be probably effective even without the tweets. With him, it's a disaster. If he resigns, the question is, what would he be replaced with, and could it be worse, is the question. And it probably could be. So.
All right, I'll give you 10-second final word.
Well, obviously, this was the establishment talking, because remember, Donald Trump was elected as the anti-establishment president. And what to the degree that Tillerson buys into a piece of that, this is going to work on reducing the size of government. This is pushing back against what we've been doing for the last 40, 50 years.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it at that. John, Ann, Robert, thank you very much. To our viewers, see you next time on International Focus.
Is it for a purpose?
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.